The thunderbolt gelding appeared at Cormac Holt's ranch fence like a ghost materializing from the desert storm, its obsidian coat gleaming wet against the lightning-split sky. Blood streaked down its flank, and terror blazed in its dark eyes. As it paced the perimeter, searching for sanctuary that seemed always just beyond reach, Cormac had been nursing his third cup of black coffee when the animal's desperate whinnying cut through the howling wind. He'd spent the last 15 years perfecting the art of solitude on his 1,000-acre spread in the Nevada high country, speaking only when necessity demanded it. The locals in Copper Creek knew him as the man who'd lost his voice along with everything else in Afghanistan, though the truth was more complicated than they imagined. The gelding reared as Cormac approached, foam flecking its muzzle, but something in the rancher's steady movements seemed to calm the creature's panic. He'd always possessed an uncanny ability to read animals, to understand their language of fear and trust in ways that human communication had never allowed him, moving with deliberate slowness. He opened the gate and stepped aside, letting the horse make its own choice. The animal hesitated at the threshold, muscles quivering with exhaustion and adrenaline. Then, as if sensing the sanctuary that Cormac offered without words, it stepped through. The rancher led it to the barn, noting the expensive tack and the careful grooming that spoke of loving hands. This wasn't a wild Mustang or abandoned ranch. Someone had treasured this animal, had invested time and money in its care. As he cleaned the wounds and settled the gelding in a stall with fresh hay and water, Cormac noticed the intricate silver brand on its shoulder, not the simple letters or symbols most ranchers used, but an elaborate design that resembled a compass rose with flowing ribbons. He'd never seen anything like it in his decades around horses. The storm raged through the night, and by morning, word had spread through the tight-knit community that Cormac Holt had taken in another stray. It was his reputation, earned through years of quietly caring for abandoned animals that others had given up on. Dogs, cats, the occasional goat, they all found their way to his ranch, drawn by some invisible signal that promised safety. But this horse was different. As days passed and no one came forward to claim it, Cormac began to suspect that its rival wasn't coincidence, but consequence. The gelding's behavior suggested extensive training. It responded to whistle commands and moved with the precision of a mount trained for specific, demanding work. Yet there was a wildness in its eyes that spoke of recent trauma, of bonds violently severed. Cormac christened the horse Meridian after the compass rose brand, and settled into the routine of rehabilitation he knew so well. But every morning, he found himself scanning the horizon, waiting for someone to come looking for what they'd lost. He didn't expect that someone to be a 17-year-old girl with steel gray eyes, and her father's ghost riding her shoulders. 3 weeks after Meridian's arrival, Cormac was mending fence when he spotted the dust cloud approaching from the main road. The battered pickup truck moved with purpose, not the casual pace of neighbors or delivery drivers. As it drew closer, he could make out a lone figure behind the wheel, someone small enough that they had to peer over the dashboard to see. The truck stopped at his gate, engine ticking in the sudden silence. A girl emerged, her auburn hair catching the afternoon light as she surveyed his property with an intensity that reminded him uncomfortably of reconnaissance missions from his military days. She wore faded jeans and boots that had seen real work, and when she finally approached the fence where he stood, her movements carried the careful precision of someone accustomed to being underestimated. "You Cormac Holt?" she asked, her voice carrying an accent he couldn't quite place. Not quite Southern, not quite Western, but something that suggested long roads and temporary homes. He nodded, studying her face and recognizing something familiar in the determined set of her jaw. "I'm looking for a horse," she continued, her eyes never leaving his. "Black gelding, silver brand shaped like a compass. Been missing 3 weeks now." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a weight that seemed too heavy for someone so young. "Did you know my father?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, carrying implications that Cormac couldn't yet grasp. He gestured toward the barn, leading the girl who'd introduced herself as Willa Carmen across the dusty yard, where chickens scattered from their path like guilt made manifest. Meridian lifted his head as they approached, and the transformation was immediate. The wariness that had defined him for 3 weeks melted away as he caught Willa's scent. He whickered softly, pressing against the stall door with an urgency that spoke of profound relief. When Willa reached through the bars to touch his muzzle, the horse's entire body seemed to exhale, as if he'd been holding his breath since the night of the storm. "Hey there, Storm Chaser," she whispered, using what was clearly the horse's real name. "I've been looking everywhere for you." Cormac watched the reunion with the careful attention he'd learned in the service, noting details that others might miss. The way Willa's hands automatically checked specific points on the horse's body, looking for signs of injury or distress. The unconscious military precision in her stance. The way she spoke to the animal in low tones that suggested shared secrets and hard-won trust. "Your father," he said finally, his voice rusty from disuse. "What was his name?" "Captain Jericho." "Carmen," she replied, not taking her eyes off Storm Chaser. "Special Forces, deployed mostly to places that don't exist on any maps you'd find in a library." She turned then, fixing him with that same steel-gray stare. He talked about a lot of people, but there was one guy he always said saved his unit when everything went sideways. Guy who could read terrain like scripture and never left anyone behind. Cormac felt something cold settle in his stomach. Jericho Carmen. The name hit him like shrapnel, carrying with it the weight of desert heat and diesel fuel, of midnight operations, and the kind of brotherhood forged in fire. He remembered a compact man with steady hands and an infectious laugh, someone who could find hope in the darkest situations and make others believe in it too. "Jerry," he said, the nickname emerging unbidden from memory. "He made it home, for a while." Willa's voice carried a brittleness that spoke of recent grief. "Bought a small spread in Montana. Bred horses for endurance riding. Said it was the closest he could get to the freedom he'd felt before the service, without actually running away from responsibility." She paused, scratching Storm Chaser's neck. "He died 6 months ago. Heart attack." The words hit harder than Cormac had expected. He'd lost touch with most of his unit after his medical discharge, finding that civilian life required a different kind of camouflage than desert warfare. But Jerry had been different, the kind of soldier who'd made everyone around him better, who'd pulled Cormac back from the edge more than once, when the darkness threatened to swallow him whole. "I'm sorry," he said, meaning it in ways that the simple words couldn't convey. "The funeral was small," Willa continued, seemingly determined to get the story out before courage failed her. "Dad didn't have much family left, and a lot of his service buddies couldn't be reached or couldn't travel, but he left instructions. If anything happened to him, I was supposed to find certain people who'd understand what the horses meant to him." She reached into her jacket and pulled out a worn leather journal, its pages swollen with years of use and weather. He kept records of everyone who mattered. Addresses, phone numbers when he could get them, notes about what they'd shared in the service. She opened it to a page marked with a faded ribbon. "Cormac Holt, Silver Creek Ranch, Nevada. The horse whisperer who could read souls. That's what he wrote about you." Cormac accepted the journal with hands that trembled slightly. His own entry was brief but detailed, including information he hadn't shared with anyone in years. But it was the notation at the bottom that made his breath catch. "If something happens to me, he'll understand what the horses represent. Trust him with everything." There were 12 horses on Dad's ranch, Willa explained, her voice growing stronger as she spoke, all bred from bloodlines he'd traced back to cavalry mounts, animals with the kind of intelligence and heart that you can't train into them. He said they carried something forward, some essential spirit that the world needed to remember. Her eyes found his again. Storm Chaser was his favorite. The one, he said, reminded him most of the horses they'd used in operations where vehicles couldn't go. A memory surfaced unbidden, Jerry leading a desert-colored mare through terrain that seemed impossible to navigate, the animal stepping carefully through rocky passages that would have challenged a mountain goat. He'd had an intuitive understanding of what horses could do when treated as partners rather than tools, and that understanding had saved lives on more than one mission. "The ranch is being sold," Willa continued. "Bank won't extend the loan." and I can't manage it alone while finishing school. But Dad made me promise that his horses would go to people who'd understand their value, not just their monetary worth, but what they represent." She gestured toward Storm Chaser, who had been listening to their conversation with the alert intelligence that Cormac recognized from his father's description. "He's the last one. The others have already been placed with Dad's friends from the service, people scattered across the country who understood what they were taking on." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but Storm Chaser wouldn't let anyone else near him. "It took me 3 weeks to track him here after he broke free from the transport trailer." The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a picture that Cormac both dreaded and expected. Jerry Carmen had been the kind of man who planned for contingencies, who thought 3 moves ahead even in civilian life. The arrival of his daughter and his favorite horse wasn't coincidence, it was intention. Reaching out from beyond death to complete unfinished business. That evening, Willa sat at Cormac's kitchen table, cradling a mug of coffee between her hands, while Storm Chaser grazed in the paddock outside the window. The ranch house was sparse but comfortable, furnished with the practical aesthetics of someone who valued function over form. Military surplus mixed with handcrafted furniture spoke of a man trying to build something permanent from temporary materials. "Tell me about the last time you saw him," Willa said, her voice cutting through the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Cormac stared into his own mug, watching steam rise like memories made visible. "Kandahar Province, 2009. We were extracting a captured intelligence officer deep behind enemy lines." He paused, the words coming slowly, as if speaking them aloud might make them more real than they'd been in his nightmares. "Jerry volunteered to stay behind with the wounded, while the rest of us cleared the extraction point." The story emerged in fragments, painted in the economical language that veterans used to describe experiences too large for civilian understanding. How Jerry had held off an advancing patrol with nothing but a damaged radio and his father's Colt .45, buying the precious minutes needed for helicopter evacuation. How he'd insisted on being the last man lifted out, despite shrapnel wounds that painted his shirt crimson. "He saved my life that day." Cormac finished, "Maybe all of our lives, but the cost." He gestured vaguely at his throat, though Willa had already guessed that his selective silence wasn't entirely voluntary. "Some prices take years to fully understand." Willa nodded with the understanding of someone who'd grown up with a father's war stories, who'd learned to read the spaces between words where the real truth lived. Dad never talked much about specific missions, but he used to get this look, sometimes like he was listening to voices only he could hear. She traced the rim of her mug with one finger. "I think you were one of those voices outside." Storm Chaser lifted his head as if sensing the weight of their conversation. The horse had adapted to ranch life with remarkable ease, but Cormac had noticed behaviors that suggested extensive specialized training. The way he responded to hand signals, his comfort with irregular schedules and sudden movement, these weren't traits developed in peaceful Montana pastures. "Your father bred him specifically for military work, didn't he?" Cormac asked. "Not military exactly, but close." Willa's expression grew thoughtful. "Dad was consulting with the Border Patrol, helping them develop mounted units for terrain where vehicles couldn't operate. Storm Chaser was his proof of concept, a horse that could navigate hostile territory while carrying supplies or personnel, intelligent enough to operate with minimal guidance." She smiled, the first genuine expression of joy he'd seen from her. "Dad said he had the heart of a war horse and the soul of a poet." The description resonated with something deep in Cormac's understanding of both animals and men. He'd known soldiers like that, people who could function in the harshest environments while maintaining something essentially gentle at their core. It was a rare combination, and one that didn't always survive the translation to civilian life. "The journal," he said, remembering the weight of it in his hands. "What else did he write about the horses?" Willa retrieved it from her jacket, flipping through pages filled with careful handwriting and pressed flowers, photographs and sketched maps. He called it his legacy project. Each horse represented something he wanted to preserve, bloodlines that carried specific traits, yes, but also connections. She found a page near the back, covered with what looked like a family tree drawn in multiple colors of ink. Look at this. The diagram showed relationships that went beyond simple breeding records. Lines connected horses to their human partners, with notations about shared experiences and complementary temperaments. Storm Chaser's entry was the most detailed, with connections drawn to specific people scattered across the country, veterans who'd found their way to horse-related careers or therapeutic programs. He was building a network, Cormac realized, using the horses as a way to maintain connections with people who understood. More than that, Willa said, turning to another page, he was creating something sustainable. Look at the breeding records, the training notes. Every horse was matched with someone who could continue the work, who could pass on both the bloodlines and the understanding of what they represented. The scope of Jerry's vision was becoming clear. This wasn't just about placing unwanted animals with good homes, it was about preserving a way of life, a set of values that had been tested in the world's most demanding circumstances and found worthy. The horses were ambassadors, carrying forward the best aspects of military culture while helping their human partners navigate the challenges of civilian life. Storm Chaser's designation was different, though. Willa continued, finding the relevant page. Dad wrote that he was meant for someone who could serve as a hub, someone with the space and knowledge to breed the next generation while training both horses and people in the old ways. She looked up from the journal, meeting his eyes directly. He wrote your name next to Storm Chaser's entry before I was even born. The implication hit Cormac like a revelation he'd been avoiding for 15 years. Jerry hadn't just been his friend and fellow soldier, he'd been planning for this moment since before his daughter existed, laying the groundwork for a legacy that would outlast his own life. The ranch, the breeding program, the careful network of connections, it was all designed to converge at this moment, in this place, with the understanding that some responsibilities transcended individual mortality. He knew, Cormac said, not making it a question. Dad was always good at reading people. Willa replied, he said you'd fight the idea at first, that you'd think you weren't qualified or deserving. But he also said that when the time came, you'd understand that qualification had nothing to do with it, that the horses would choose their own partners, just like they always had. As if summoned by their conversation, Storm Chaser approached the kitchen window, pressing his muzzle against the glass with gentle insistence. His dark eyes held an intelligence that seemed almost human, and Cormac found himself thinking of the countless animals that had found their way to his ranch over the years. He'd always told himself it was coincidence that his reputation for kindness had simply attracted strays, but looking at Storm Chaser, he began to wonder if there had been a deeper pattern at work, if Jerry's influence had been reaching across the years. To prepare him for this moment, 3 days later, Cormac found himself mounted on Storm Chaser, testing the bond between them across the challenging terrain of his back 40. The horse moved with fluid precision through rocky draws and steep inclines, responding to subtle shifts in weight and pressure rather than traditional rein commands. It was riding of a different order entirely, requiring trust and communication that went beyond mechanical control. Willa rode beside him on Sage, one of Cormac's older mares, documenting their progress with the thoroughness her father had taught her. She'd inherited Jerry's eye for detail, noting how Storm Chaser adapted his gait to match the terrain, how he seemed to anticipate obstacles before they became visible, how he moved with Cormac as if they'd been partners for years rather than days. Dad would have loved this, she said as they paused at a ridge overlooking the valley. He always said the real test of a partnership wasn't in the arena or on easy ground, but when everything around you was trying to kill you, and you had to depend on each other completely. Below them, the Silver Creek Ranch spread out in a patchwork of pastures and buildings, looking deceptively peaceful in the afternoon light. But Cormac could see it now through Jerry's eyes, recognizing the strategic advantages of the location: water access, multiple escape routes, high ground for observation, terrain that would challenge both horses and riders without being impossible to navigate. He chose this place specifically, didn't he? Cormac asked. He spent 2 years researching properties before he found yours, Willa confirmed. Said it had everything needed for what he had in mind: space for a breeding program, terrain for training, and most importantly, the right person to carry it forward. She adjusted her position in the saddle, unconsciously mimicking her father's economical riding style. He bought the Montana ranch as a temporary base, but this was always the real target. The revelation should have felt invasive. The idea that his life had been observed and evaluated from a distance. Instead, Cormac felt something like relief. For 15 years, he'd been trying to build meaning from the fragments of his military experience, never quite understanding why certain choices felt inevitable while others left him restless and unsatisfied. To know that Jerry had seen purpose in his path, had trusted him with something precious, it provided a framework for understanding that had been missing. Storm Chaser shifted beneath him, responding to his mood with the sensitivity that marked truly exceptional horses. The gelding's training was becoming more apparent with each ride, revealing layers of conditioning that spoke of years of careful development. He could navigate by compass heading, respond to whistle commands from significant distances, and maintain steady performance under physical stress that would exhaust lesser animals. "What happens now?" Cormac asked as they began the descent toward home. "That depends on you," Willa replied. Dad's plan was always flexible, based on what people were ready for rather than what he thought they should want. She guided Sage around a loose section of scree with practiced ease, but he did leave some specific suggestions. That evening, she spread the contents of a manila envelope across his kitchen table: legal documents, breeding records, and a detailed business plan that demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking Jerry had been famous for in the service. The proposal was elegant in its simplicity. Used Storm Chaser as the foundation stallion for a breeding program designed to produce horses capable of specialized work, while developing a training facility that could serve both civilian and government clients. The financial projections were conservative but promising, based on market research that showed increasing demand for horses trained in tactical applications, border patrol, search and rescue. Even some private security firms were recognizing the value of mounted units in specific environments. The network Jerry had developed through his horse placements would provide both breeding stock and potential clients, creating a sustainable business model that honored the animal's capabilities while generating enough income to maintain the operation. He estimated it would take 3 years to become fully operational, Willa explained, pointing to a timeline that showed careful progression from basic breeding through advanced training programs. But he also said that the real value wouldn't be measured in dollars, it would be in the connections formed and the knowledge preserved. Cormac studied the documents with the attention they deserved, recognizing Jerry's hand in every detail. His friend had understood that successful transitions required more than good intentions. They needed practical frameworks that could survive the inevitable challenges of implementation. The plan accounted for setbacks and seasonal variations, for the time needed to develop expertise and the patience required to build reputation. "There's one more thing," Willa said, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty. "Dad wanted you to have the choice, but he also wanted you to understand what you'd be taking on." She retrieved another folder from her bag, this one marked with Jerry's distinctive handwriting: "For Cormac when you're ready." Inside were letters from the other veterans who'd received horses from Jerry's program, documenting their experiences and the impact the animals had made on their post-service lives. Stories of healing and purpose, of partnerships that had provided structure and meaning when civilian life felt impossible to navigate, but also accounts of the responsibility involved, the commitment required to maintain the standards Jerry had established. "It's not just about breeding horses," Willa said, as he read. "It's about carrying forward something that Dad believed was essential to understanding, that some bonds transcend individual survival, that the best parts of military culture can be preserved and adapted for civilian use." She paused, watching his face carefully, "but only if someone's willing to accept that responsibility completely." Storm Chaser whinnied from the paddock, a sound that carried clearly through the evening air. Cormac looked up from the letters to find the horse watching the house, his posture alert but relaxed. In the fading light, he could see the careful breeding that had gone into the animal's creation, the powerful hindquarters that could drive him up impossible slopes, The deep chest that provided endurance for long journeys, the intelligent eyes that seemed to evaluate everything around him for potential threat or opportunity. But more than breeding, he could see Jerry's influence in the horse's behavior, the careful training that had developed natural talent into specialized capability. Storm Chaser wasn't just a well-bred animal, he was a living embodiment of everything. Jerry had learned about the partnership between human and horse, refined through years of patient development and tested in conditions that demanded absolute reliability. The weight of the decision settled on Cormac's shoulders like familiar equipment, carrying the kind of responsibility he'd thought he'd left behind in Afghanistan. But this was different from military obligation. This was choice, freely made and fully understood. With the knowledge that Jerry had trusted him with something irreplaceable, the next morning brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Colonel Marcus Thorne, arriving in a dust-covered SUV that suggested hard miles and official business. Cormac recognized the type. Before introductions were made, career military transitioning to private sector consulting, carrying the weight of command experience and the sharp attention that came from years of evaluating personnel and situations. Captain Carmen asked me to check in on his daughter, Thorne explained, accepting coffee with the automatic courtesy of someone accustomed to hospitality in difficult circumstances. We served together in Iraq before he moved to Special Forces. Good man, solid judgment. His eyes took in the ranch with professional assessment. He spoke highly of you, Sergeant Holt. The use of his old rank wasn't accidental, Cormac realized. Thorne was establishing credentials and respect while delivering information that required military context to fully understand. Willa listened from the kitchen doorway, her expression suggesting this wasn't entirely unexpected. The Border Patrol contract Jerry was working on when he died, Thorne continued. It's still active, still needs someone to fulfill the training requirements. He set down his mug and leaned forward slightly. The agency is willing to work with Jerry's designated successor if that person meets the security clearance requirements and demonstrates competence with the program he developed. The offer carried implications that went beyond simple business opportunity. Government contracts provided stability and credibility that would make the broader breeding program feasible, while connecting Cormac to the kind of purposeful work that had been missing from his civilian life. But it also meant accepting visibility and responsibility that he'd been avoiding since his discharge. What's the timeline? He asked. 6 months to demonstrate basic capability. 2 years to full program implementation, Thorne replied. The horses Jerry placed with other veterans would be available for breeding loans, creating a genetic foundation that could support sustained operations. He glanced toward the paddock where Storm Chaser was grazing. That one's already been cleared for program use, assuming ownership transfers properly. Willa stepped forward, her jaw set with familiar determination. I've been thinking about the transfer question, she said. Storm Chaser legally belongs to Dad's estate, which means I have the right to place him where I think he'll do the most good. She looked directly at Cormac. But I don't want this to feel like charity or obligation. If you take him, it should be because you want what he represents, not because you feel responsible for Dad's plans. The distinction mattered more than Cormac had realized. Jerry's vision required commitment that went beyond duty or friendship. It demanded personal investment in an idea that might take years to fully implement. The horses weren't just animals to be cared for. They were partners in preserving something valuable that the modern world tended to discard. Colonel Thorne excused himself to inspect the facilities, leaving Cormac and Willa alone with the weight of decision hanging between them. Through the window, they could see him examining the barn and paddock areas with the systematic attention of someone evaluating operational readiness. You're scared, Willa observed, her tone carrying understanding rather than judgment. Terrified, Cormac admitted. Your father saw something in me that I'm not sure exists anymore. What if I take this on and fail? What if I damage something he spent years building? Dad told me something once about fear and readiness, she said, settling into the chair across from him. He said that the people who worried most about being worthy were usually the ones who could be trusted with important things because they understood the weight of responsibility. She smiled, the expression transforming her face. He also said that Storm Chaser would make his own choice, regardless of what any human decided. As if summoned by their conversation, the horse in question appeared at the kitchen window, pressing his muzzle against the glass with gentle insistence. His timing was so perfect that both humans laughed, the sound breaking the tension that had been building all morning. Colonel Thorne returned with an expression of professional approval. "Jerry chose well," he said simply. "The facilities need some updating for program requirements, but the foundation is solid. More importantly, the location provides everything needed for specialized training while maintaining the privacy that government clients require." He handed Cormac a thick folder, preliminary contracts and program specifications. "If you decide to move forward, the financial terms are generous, reflecting both the specialized nature of the work and the government's investment in Jerry's research." He paused at the door. "Take your time with the decision, but understand that opportunities like this don't come along often." Jerry spent 5 years positioning everything for this moment. After Thorne's departure, Cormac found himself alone with Storm Chaser in the paddock, grooming the horse while processing everything he'd learned. The animal stood with the patience of someone accustomed to being the center of important conversations, occasionally turning his head to observe his human's face with intelligent attention. "What do you think?" Cormac asked, running his hands along the horse's neck. "Ready to be the foundation of something bigger than both of us?" Storm Chaser's response was immediate and unmistakable. He turned to face Cormac directly, placing his forehead against the man's chest in a gesture that spoke of acceptance and partnership. The contact carried weight that went beyond simple affection, establishing a bond that felt both new and inevitable. Willa's voice carried from the fence where she'd been watching. "Dad always said that horses choose their people, not the other way around." She climbed through the rails to join them. "Looks like Storm Chaser's made his decision." That evening, as the three of them, human, horse, and young woman carrying her father's legacy, stood together in the Nevada twilight, Cormac felt something shift inside him. The careful isolation he'd maintained for 15 years wasn't serving him anymore, and the opportunity Jerry had created offered more than just meaningful work. It promised connection to something larger than individual survival, participation in a vision that honored the best aspects of military experience while creating value for the civilian world. "Okay," he said, the word carrying more weight than its brevity suggested. "Let's do this right." 6 months later, the Silver Creek Ranch hummed with purposeful activity as the first Border Patrol training class prepared for their final evaluation. 8 agents and their mounts worked through complex exercises that tested navigation, communication, and tactical awareness in terrain that challenged both human and equine capabilities. Storm Chaser, now fully established as the program's foundation stallion, observed from his paddock with the satisfied attention of a patriarch watching his influence spread. Cormac moved among the students with confidence that had grown steadily as he'd found his voice in teaching. The selective silence that had defined his post-service years had evolved into careful communication, each word chosen for maximum impact rather than minimum risk. The horses had given him a language that translated military experience into civilian understanding, creating bridges between worlds that often seemed incompatible. "Remember, you're not controlling your mount, you're communicating with a partner who has capabilities you lack," he told Agent Rivera, who was struggling with the concept of trust-based riding. "Storm Chaser's bloodline gives your horse instincts, developed over generations of working in dangerous terrain. Your job is to provide intelligence and direction, while staying out of the way of those instincts." The transformation in Rivera's riding was immediate and dramatic as she relaxed into partnership rather than dominance. Her mare, a Storm Chaser daughter named Compass Rose, responded by moving with increased confidence through the rocky terrain that had been challenging them all morning. Willa documented the exercise from various angles, her photography capturing moments that would be used in program marketing and government reports. She'd deferred college for a year to help establish the operation, discovering talents for administration and public relations that complemented her inherited understanding of horses. The arrangement worked for everyone. Cormac got essential support during the startup phase, while Willa gained experience that would serve her well in whatever direction her life ultimately took. "Dad would have loved this," she said during a break, watching the agents work with their mounts in the kind of partnership Jerry had always envisioned. The horses are doing exactly what he hoped, creating connections that go beyond simple utility. The breeding program was exceeding projections, with Storm Chaser's offspring demonstrating the intelligence and versatility that made them suitable for multiple applications. Search and rescue organizations were placing orders, as were therapeutic riding programs that could benefit from horses trained to remain calm under stress. The network Jerry had established was functioning as designed, creating markets and referrals that sustained growth while maintaining quality standards. But the real success was measured in smaller moments, the way Agent Martinez's confidence had grown as he learned to trust his mount's judgment, how Agent Chen had overcome her fear of heights by partnering with a horse that specialized in mountain terrain, the bonds forming between human and animal that would outlast the training program and influence careers for years to come. Colonel Thorne arrived for the final evaluation with a team of Border Patrol supervisors, their expressions mixing professional skepticism with curiosity about Jerry's unconventional approach to mounted units. Cormac had learned to read such audiences, understanding that demonstration spoke more eloquently than explanation. When dealing with people accustomed to measuring results rather than methods, the evaluation course tested everything the students had learned: navigation through unmarked terrain, communication under stress, tactical positioning, and the kind of decision-making that couldn't be taught in classrooms. Each agent and horse team faced scenarios that required them to function as integrated units, drawing on both human intelligence and equine capability to achieve objectives that would be impossible for either species alone. Agent Rivera and Compass Rose demonstrated the tracking sequence, following a cold trail through terrain that would challenge experienced hunters. The mare's ability to detect scent traces invisible to human perception, combined with Rivera's tactical awareness, created a tracking capability that impressed even the skeptical supervisors. Time to target acquisition was 40% faster than our current best practices, Colonel Thorne noted, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose faith in unconventional methods had been vindicated. And that's with agents who've had 6 months of training versus years of traditional mounted patrol experience. The afternoon concluded with a demonstration that Jerry would have appreciated. Storm Chaser working with Cormac through a course that showcased the partnership Jerry had envisioned. The stallion moved through complex terrain with fluid precision, responding to subtle cues while maintaining awareness of his environment that allowed him to anticipate and avoid obstacles. But more than technical skill, their performance demonstrated the trust and communication that formed the foundation of everything Jerry had taught. As the official evaluation concluded and the Border Patrol team prepared to depart, Colonel Thorne pulled Cormac aside for a private conversation. "Jerry would have been proud," he said simply. "You've taken his vision and made it your own," which is exactly what he hoped would happen. He handed over a sealed envelope. "One final thing he asked me to deliver." When the program was fully operational, inside was a single sheet of paper with Jerry's familiar handwriting. "Cormac, if you're reading this, it means you found the courage to accept something I always knew you were capable of. The horses were never the real legacy, they were just the means. The legacy is what you've built, the connections you've created, the knowledge you've preserved and passed forward. Thank you for carrying this forward. Thank you for understanding that some things are too important to let die with the people who created them. Your friend always, Jerry." That evening, as the ranch settled into quiet routine after the excitement of evaluation day, Cormac found himself in the paddock with Storm Chaser, sharing the kind of companionable silence that had become their custom. The stallion grazed peacefully, while his human companion processed the day's achievements and the weight of Jerry's final message. "Will it join?"